Empires do not collapse in a single day. They accumulate privileges, they accumulate debt, they accumulate illusions. And then, someone declares that power is no longer sacred. By 1789, France stood as Europe's colossus. 28 million souls, the continent's most populous kingdom after Russia, heir to 13 centuries of unbroken monarchy stretching back through the Carolingian mists to Clovis himself. Paris set the intellectual tempo for every enlightened court from St. Petersburg to London. French was the language of power. French philosophy was the currency of revolutionary thought. And yet, within 3 years, this edifice would execute its own king, declare war on every neighboring monarchy, and drown itself in blood. The question isn't whether the old regime was unjust. Medieval Europe was built on injustice. The question is why this particular injustice, which had held for centuries, suddenly became unbearable. The architecture was elegant in its brutality. 3 estates, each with its designated function in the cosmic order. Those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, everyone else. The king, Louis XVI by 1774, married to the Austrian Marie Antoinette, stood above all 3, anointed by God, embodying the state itself. This wasn't tyranny, it was absolutism, and absolutism was a deal. The nobility had surrendered political autonomy in exchange for ironclad economic privilege. They no longer challenged the king in their provincial strongholds. Instead, they ruled their lands as untouchable fiefdoms, extracting tithes, taxes, and feudal dues from peasants who had no recourse. The clergy collected their own parallel tax system, the tithe that could reach 20%. Both orders paid nothing to the state. The Third Estate paid everything. But here was the fracture already forming. That Third Estate no longer meant just peasants bent over fields. It now included manufacturers, ship owners, colonial plantation magnates worth more than most aristocrats. Wealthy merchants who dressed plainly, not from poverty but from legal prohibition, sumptuary laws that marked their exclusion from power even as their wealth exceeded it. They sat in salons alongside nobles, funding the same philosophers, reading the same books. But the moment they entered a room, everyone knew what they were. France was a patchwork quilt of privileges: guild monopolies, city exemptions, regional tax codes, purchased nobility, hereditary nobility, 1,000 legal categories determining who could wear what, sit where, do what. No universal law existed. Your rights depended on where you were born, what your father did, which city charter applied. The system had calcified over centuries, each crisis adding another layer of special privilege that was never removed when the crisis passed. It couldn't evolve. It could only accumulate weight until something broke. The break came from an unexpected direction: bankruptcy. France had spent the 18th century locked in global conflict with Britain, the 7 Years' War, then bankrolling the American Revolution. Both were disasters for the treasury. The Americans won their independence citing French philosophers like Rousseau. France won nothing but debt. By 1788, the state was paying more in interest than it collected in revenue. Creditors, many of them domestic bankers and wealthy commoners, were charging 10% annually. The machinery of absolutism required money, and there was none left. Louis XVI faced a choice no French king had confronted in 175 years. Call the Estates General, a representative assembly of all 3 orders, and ask for help. This was the miscalculation that ended the world. When the king announced the Estates General for May 1789, he thought he was asking for a loan. What he did was grant permission for every grievance in France to organize itself. The call went out. Send representatives, compile your complaints, come to Paris. Across the kingdom, people who had never participated in politics suddenly had a forum. They wrote cahiers, lists of demands. They elected delegates. The Third Estate, which outnumbered the other two orders combined, arrived in Paris believing this was their moment. The king's advisors, steeped in medieval procedure, insisted on the traditional format. Each estate votes as a bloc, one order, one vote. This meant the clergy and nobility, voting together, could outvote the commoners on anything that threatened their privileges, which was everything that mattered. The Third Estate delegates saw the trap immediately. They had come expecting reform. They found a rigged game. So they left. On June 17, 1789, the commoner delegates walked out of the Estates General and reconvened in a nearby tennis court. There, with no legal authority whatsoever, they declared themselves the National Constituent Assembly, representatives not of an estate, but of the nation itself. They swore an oath. They would not disband until France had a constitution limiting royal power. This was the revolutionary moment. Not a violent uprising, not a manifesto, just a claim. We are the legitimate voice of France. The king could have arrested them. He hesitated. In that hesitation, nobles and clergy who supported reform began crossing over to join the assembly. The facade of unity cracked. Then Paris exploded. Rumors spread that the king was massing troops to dissolve the assembly by force. On July 14th, crowds stormed a military warehouse, seized weapons, then marched on the Bastille fortress prison for gunpowder. The governor refused to surrender. They killed him and paraded his head through the streets. The king at Versailles asked an advisor, "Is this a revolt?" "No, sire, it is a revolution." The assembly moved quickly to dismantle the architecture that had held France together. In August, they abolished feudalism in a single night session. Nobles, caught in revolutionary fervor or reading the room, renounced their own privileges in cascading speeches. Centuries of accumulated rights evaporated in hours. Then they went after the church. In November 1789, they nationalized all church lands, the largest property confiscation in European history. Clergy would now be paid by the state, elected by citizens, required to swear loyalty oaths. Bishops who refused were driven out. The revolution had severed the link between French Catholicism and Rome. The king, under pressure, signed everything, but he was planning his escape. In June 1791, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette disguised themselves and fled toward the Austrian border, hoping to rally foreign armies to restore their power. They were recognized in a small town, stopped, and brought back to Paris under guard. The sacred aura of monarchy, the divine right, the anointed authority, shattered. He wasn't a father protecting his people. He was a man running away. Austria and Prussia issued a declaration threatening France if the royal family was harmed. The Assembly declared war. War changed everything. Military defeats on the border were blamed on royalist sabotage. Radicalized troops, fresh from battle, marched on the palace in August 1792 and overthrew the monarchy. Louis XVI became citizen capet, prisoner of the state. By January 1793, he was dead on the guillotine, executed for treason. The revolution devoured its own logic. The Assembly gave way to the Convention. The Convention fell under the control of the Committee of Public Safety. The committee fell under the control of one man, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was a lawyer from Arras who had read Rousseau until he believed in the perfectibility of man through reason. He was incorruptible, ascetic, and convinced that virtue required violence. Under his leadership, the Committee of Public Safety became a dictatorship justified by emergency. The decree on suspicious persons authorized mass arrests on the vaguest grounds: foreign connections, aristocratic ties, insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm. Some 400,000 were imprisoned. Their property was confiscated to fund the war. Revolutionary commissars fanned out across France with arrest powers, overriding local authorities, answering only to Paris. This was no longer liberation. It was the invention of the modern police state: surveillance, denunciation, ideological purity tests, centralized control through dispersed agents. The revolution had promised to replace arbitrary royal power with rational law. Instead, it created a machine for eliminating anyone the state deemed suspicious. By 1794, the terror was consuming revolutionaries themselves. Robespierre sent former allies to the guillotine. In July, the convention turned on him. He was arrested, his jaw shattered by a gunshot, self-inflicted or attempted execution, accounts differ, and executed the next day. France emerged from the revolution exhausted, traumatized, and utterly transformed. The estates were gone. The church was neutered. Feudalism was abolished. The legal principle of equality before the law was established, even if practice lagged behind. But the deeper shift was structural. Sovereignty had moved. It no longer resided in a bloodline blessed by God. It resided in the nation, an abstract collective will that could be claimed by whoever organized it most effectively. The revolution proved that sacred authority could be torn down in months, that constitutions could be written by human beings, that power flowed not from heaven, but from control of institutions, propaganda, and armed force. Within a decade, Napoleon would seize that machinery and crown himself emperor, exporting revolutionary war across Europe. The monarchies that crushed him would spend the next century terrified of what France had demonstrated: that the entire edifice of hereditary rule rested on a fiction, and fictions could be dispelled. The French Revolution didn't just change who held power, it changed what power was, from a divine inheritance to a contestable claim that anyone with organization, ideology, and timing could seize. Every revolution since has followed the template Paris established: the bankruptcy, the assembly, the radicalization, the terror, the strongman. The architecture of the old world didn't evolve, it collapsed. And in its place, modernity built itself from the rubble.